So thank you all for joining today to discuss the impact of COVID-19 on tourism. And we have here Dr. Wantanee Suntikul from Hong Kong Polytechnic University, Professor Joseph Chiu from Wakayama University, and Professor Stephen Pratt from University of South Pacific. And I'm Denis Tolkach from James Cook University in Cairns. First I would like to ask you, what was the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the places where you live and work? And we'll start with Wantanee because you live in Hong Kong and it was the place that is close to China, close proximity to where the epidemic began. And also it's interesting. Yeah, it's also quite interesting and worrisome that tourism has been affected by the protests already in the second half of last year. And then there is this new crisis. So can you tell us a little bit about how tourism is faring in Hong Kong?
Wow, it's like kind of this is like, I want to start with statistic, you know, like you heard about the protests already. I think the protests, Hong Kong protests started around June, right? Last year, 2019. And look at the statistic, you know, from May, June when it started, the decline of tourism wasn't that bad. And it started to decline in July, actually in 2019. And from like compared to 2018, the same month, July, last 2018 was like 5.4 million, and July 2019 was like 5.1, and then it's gradually declined, but it's not that, you know, dramatic. I think that's more dramatic. It is in November. Which is like from 2019, the visitor arrival was like 5.9, and in 2019, it was a 2.6 million only. And again, you know, December also cut by half, and well, and then they're starting the COVID-19, and compared to January and February 2019 to 2020. So statistic, you know, from January and February 2019 is about like 12,000 visitors to Hong Kong. And this year, January, February 2020, we have about like 3.4 million visitors, which is like February, I think hit the hardest. I think I have statistic here, roughly about like 100,000 visitors, or, you know, over 100,000 visitors visiting Hong Kong, which is very dramatic. You know, like, so I see that, you know, during the protests, there's still some tourists, right? Even though like kind of November, December cut by half, but we still saw some kind of tourists coming. But, you know, COVID, just like kind of, they're expecting that maybe a month to come will be zero tourists. And this is, we're not counting kind of, even though some flights coming, but mostly a lot of like kind of citizens, Hong Kong citizens. Yeah, so this is like very dramatic, yeah.
And is it the same in Japan, Joseph?
Ah, okay. I had to quickly look up some data as well. Well, the thing is, just as an aside, I'm currently in Melbourne, in Australia, where my family live. And what is quite interesting is that, in contrast to the public sentiment in Australia, especially in Melbourne, about the virus, Japan was very relaxed when I left there 2 weeks ago, in late March. For example, in late March in Japan, things were pretty much normal. You could go to the shops, restaurants were open, bars and pubs were open. And I think there was a great sense of confidence that Japan could deal with the virus very well. And if you look at the raw data on the number of cases in Japan, it's been very low compared to other developed countries. There's some thought that, like a lot of countries, unless you're testing, you don't know, right? And in Japan, there was some thought that testing was pulled back while the Olympics was still a live thing. And as soon as the Olympics was postponed, it seemed that the situation changed quite remarkably. And about 2 weeks ago was the height of the cherry blossom and in Tokyo. And you would have seen photos in the media of hundreds of people in the streets, enjoying the cherry blossom. And that coincided with when the Olympics were cancelled. And as we see today, the number of cases in Japan, in Tokyo as an example today, I think there was about 500 new cases overnight. So things are changing in Japan quite considerably. And a lot of people have been asking, why has Japan managed to deal with this quite productively? Because you might remember back in February, there was a cruise ship off Yokohama, and they didn't know what to do with the cruise ship, right? Much like what Sydney is dealing with now. And but at that point, things were still very relaxed. And it's only in the last week, actually 2 days ago, that a state of emergency was announced in Japan, meaning that, people had to work from home. But my colleagues in Japan overnight told me that they're struggling in Japan because Japanese people are used to going into the office rather than working from home. So trying to get people to work from home has been a very difficult thing. Of course, they've banned foreigners from coming into Japan from a range of different countries. So for the moment, the impact on tourism in Japan is still yet to play out. But if we look at the data for January as an example, year-on-year arrivals in February rather. In February, 1.1 million foreigners visited Japan. So that's still quite a lot, considering that in February, coronavirus was quite a big thing, right? But year on year, its arrivals to Japan in February were down by about 60%. So that's quite considerable. So I think we're yet to see the full impact of the virus on tourism arrivals to Japan, but I imagine it's going to drop quite considerably, Denis. I can refer to some other data later on, but yeah, it's still too early to tell in Japan, but it looks like it will be dramatic.
Yeah. And your university hosted one of the last tourism conferences before the lockdowns, the Critical Tourism Studies Asia Pacific.
Yes.
And I remember there was a session discussing COVID-19 at that time. Can you tell us a little bit about the summary of what you discussed and maybe how it changed in the few months since then?
Yeah. So that was February 17th to the 19th. That's, that's nearly 2 months ago now. And what we knew then is very different to what we know now, right? I mean, we went ahead with the conference on the advice of the prefecture and on the advice of the university's medical officer. But you're right, it's probably the last tourism conference that was run this year. And we probably had about 15% of delegates cancel, mainly from China, because they weren't able to come into Japan. But other than that, most people who came seemed to be observing the suggested advice to not shake hands, to not hug, to, wearing masks. And when we considered the impacts of COVID-19 back then, this is 2 months ago, things were pretty stable in the US, in Australia, so we didn't really envision that it would get to this extent. Some of the things we discussed were in relation to mobilities and immobilities, especially out of China. I think because at that point, China being the largest outbound tourism market around the globe, we saw considerable drop-offs. And, one of the things that preoccupied us was, what do we do? How do destinations deal with the drop-off from China? But of course that drop-off is much wider than just China now, right? We were also discussing cruise tourism, which was the topic of the moment there. And since then, you know, we've seen cruise tourism has taken a real dive in popularity, and it would be interesting to see how quickly it returns as a tourism activity. But at that time, Denis and Stephen Wantanee, foreign tourists were still coming into Japan. So I think much of what we discussed back then was very premature, because anyone who says they know how this is going to unfold or how destinations should deal with this, you're really just guessing, right?
Yeah.
I just wonder, like, what nationality is that? Like kind of a majority who visited Japan, like in January and February.
Yeah. There was still some Chinese coming in via third countries. There were no Koreans because, of course, Japan and Korea had an ongoing bilateral diplomatic argument. But at that point, in mid-February, some Chinese were still traveling. Right? They were traveling via Taiwan or Hong Kong or other countries like Thailand, and then coming to Japan. But a lot of Westerners were still coming to Japan, Australians, Americans, and of course it was peak ski season as well, right? So in Hokkaido, as an example, Hokkaido, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I actually think that, when it first sort of made the headlines, I think people saw it as a regional type epidemic that was more going to be something more like SARS, restricted to China, maybe a little bit of Southeast Asia, or MERS type thing, the Middle East, North Africa type. I think that's how people or the industry sort of perceived it, at least back in early February, is my sort of feeling.
And how are you doing, Steve, in Fiji? And there was a cyclone that just came through. Yeah.
So it's always extreme weather events happening in Fiji. So I gotta say, I haven't looked at the exact numbers, but I got a recent document by ANZ, one of the banks, who in their model, they suggested that Fiji will lose about 600,000 visitors by air this year, which is about 67%. And that translates to Fijian dollars 1.4 billion in tourism receipts, and GDP will subtract by 12 percentage points. So it's the more tourism dependent the country is, the more they're going to be affected. Most of nearly all of the hotels are closed, except if they're quarantine hotels. And people have been suggested to go back to the village. At the moment, there's only 15 cases at the moment, and no fatalities yet. And so different parts of the country are under lockdown, depending on where the infected person was moving about before they were tested. So so there's only a few recovery flights getting Fijians back or sending expatriates or tourists home. So I think earlier this week, there was a flight to Los Angeles and a flight to Sydney, and maybe one other flight. And those flights are also bringing back medical equipment.
Yeah, on the topic of returning to home country, Joseph, can you share experience of being in isolation and flying back to Australia in this time? How did it feel?
Yeah. Well, I pretty much got the last Qantas flight out of Tokyo for Australia, and it was quite full. And I guess the Australian government was keen on getting Australians to return as quick as possible. So when I left Tokyo, on arrival in Australia, there was a great deal of criticism about how the Australian government was handling it. But when I arrived in Sydney, there was a very detailed briefing of all passengers. We had to fill out forms to say where we were going to be. They issued masks to all of the passengers, and we had to wear it, which is quite different. In Japan, wearing masks was a common thing even before COVID-19, right, and other Asian countries. But in Australia, it hasn't been so much. So we had to wear masks. We had to sanitize our hands. And, we had to fill out a lot of forms to say where we were going to be. And on the forms, they were going to be used for the border agencies to observe whether we were following protocols. In my case, my family brought the car to the airport, gave me the keys. The car was full of food, and I went down to a beach house down in the country, down on the coast, about 1 hour from Melbourne. But I stayed there for a week because what was happening was a lot of city people were leaving the city and going to small country towns that didn't have the capacity to deal with them should they be ill, So it kind of put me in a difficult position because, trying to be responsible. What I found was down on the coast, people were doing things as they would normally do. They were going to the beach, they were surfing, they were, So the observation of the required behaviors was still really quite loosely adhered to. So I came back to Melbourne, and there's more of an adherence to that in Melbourne. Staying at home, with only essential services open, like supermarkets and service petrol stations are the only things open. Really, most other things are closed. So it's a very surreal environment because it's, everything's almost at a standstill. But over the last few days, what we hear now as Australia starts flattening the curve, to use the term, there are noises being made to slowly start pulling back on this lockdown situation and start allowing business to operate as normal. And it seems like the longer this goes for, of course, the economic impact will be greater. And I think the Australian government is starting to think seriously about, do we really need to continue down this path? And more you might see that all over the place in Fiji and in Hong Kong as well. This idea that, in order to preserve the economy and society in general, we might need to just allow some people, the vulnerable, to be the casualties of this, right? But I'm not sure. I think each day brings a different thing, Denis. So to be equivocal about what we're going to do next week is really difficult, right? But for now, I think the economic impact is huge.
Yeah. So
sorry.
Yeah. So it's a little bit similar here in Cairns. So we've had 32 cases up to now, and I think 20 already recovered. And starting from January, there was the impact on tourism. So first it was end of January was the Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year. So that was the first alarm for the tourism industry. So it's okay, we lost one market, and for Cairns it's a major international market, but still most people who come to Cairns are domestic travelers. So then when Europe started getting the epidemic, people say, okay, we lost international markets, but we still have the domestic markets. And that was February. And then March, we were still discussing that, okay, we can focus on the domestic market and then just on Queensland, the intrastate travel. And it was only a couple of weeks ago that everything had to be really closed and most businesses are closed. But when I talked to some of the tour operators, they said, well, the health of my parents is more important than my business. So it's better to stay in the lockdown and ensure that everyone is safe, even though it's a big personal cost. But, even people who own businesses, they have their own parents. So I'm not sure to what extent the colon opening the economy would resonate even with the business community.
Mm.
Wantanee, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just like want to add to what Joseph said about the it's very difficult to predict what would happen next, like kind of like in Hong Kong case, the government, and we thought pretty much that we had everything in control, and then next day the new cases came up, and then and then new regulation. So like last week there was like there were a couple of new regulations. We're not allowed to gather for more than 4 people each time in public space, right? And also like gym and like spas or that like kind of karaoke space, are all closed. And so, and then now they're talking about they have to be more strict. Now we have about like over 900 cases, which is like for Hong Kong, they, how they panic, right? And even university, like for us, we changed like, 3 weeks ago, so okay, in April it's going to be face-to-face, allow face-to-face for only particular subjects, right? And then just suddenly, like the increase in number of the positive cases, they said, okay, no more. And then they just announced that they're going to be no more, maybe summer school. And so it's very hard to predict, like kind of what will happen, next. But the government is like, as a Hong Kong, as you know already, right? You've been here long enough that they always inject some money. And it was like very interesting because I was looking at the fiscal reserve, right? Like 2017 or so, they had about like nearly 2 trillion Hong Kong dollars, right? Now I think they're talking about 1.1, and then they're going to inject more into like tourism and like kind of businesses. And so I have statistic here that like kind of HKTB, I think you'll be interested in this, right? HKTB, the Hong Kong Tourism Board, would spend about like 400 million to support and promote cities tourism. And so they would like to also the campaign they want to aim to boost the local consumer confidence, right? And enhance tourism prospects and the overseas tourism market. And so they say that to lift up the consumer confidence, they kind of giving some sort of like an example that the government, the campaign would support local restaurants to provide limited discount, right? And 2-for-1 special offers, etc. Right? It's like interesting because it's like you give discount to boost consumer confidence, right? Okay, like that's interesting. Like you can discount, all right, you risk your life or something. And but the restaurants now definitely losing money because the number, as I mentioned, no more than 4 people at a time, and then also space. So just imagine a restaurant in Hong Kong usually is so packed. You sit so close to each other, right? They squeeze you in, but now they have to leave empty table, right? And then they have to kind of make sure that, like space between like table, the next table, which is like, it is like, I went, we still went out and I go out and still people, go out for dinner, how it is like in Hong Kong, the kitchen's very small, apartment's very small, but it is very difficult for people to cook at home, right? And so this is like kind of the government provides some sort of like kind of fundings, and also like kind of tour operators receive some funding too, and like the what is it, the latest one, I think the what I put it here, I think Cathay Pacific also received some money. They will get about like 236 million. And the airport authority also to buy about like 500, like 500,000 tickets, from the airlines to help, with this industry, which is like So I'm just interested, I'm interested in like kind of, there's so much money. So as of like 2019, 2020, they have like 1.1 trillion fiscal reserve, which is like apparently is one of the largest in the world still, so yeah. There's something I want to add about like what actually like there's a lot going on, we don't know like what's next. And so at the moment it's not actually locked down in a way. Still go out, I still take a bus, and yeah. So the business is continue, but kind of it's kind of may scale down, I would say that, and, yeah.
Yeah, here I think many businesses have shut their doors. The ones that have some financial reserves, they are doing some renovation or refurbishment, so they're trying to invest into the future when the businesses will be open again. And I generally lost track of the different stimulus packages that are provided by the state government and the federal government. There seems to be a lot of different programs going on.
Yeah, I just want to add two things. One, there's a fear in the Pacific, of course, if it spreads. And I looked last week, 10 out of the 18 countries that don't have any cases or confirmed cases, Pacific Island countries, and they've shut their borders and with no plans to reopen them. And I think one of the mitigating factors to this is the sort of communal way of life that is prevalent in the Pacific. So extended family, in the same household, you just have a large number of people. There's still, people are still being arrested for breaking the socialization laws by having kava parties and socializing, including, I think they've arrested about close to 300 people. I would guess that close to about 10% of those are policemen off duty. This sort of thing is just habitual, and I think once, if it really gets out, then it'll just be extremely difficult to contain, once it has. And I mean, similar to other places, the Fiji government have allocated 1.3 billion Fijian dollars, different sectors, of course, tourism, they've agriculture as well for food security. Banks have been, let's say, relaxed some of their need for repayments, and yeah. So I think these things are quite similar elsewhere around the world. I heard SPTO, they're called South Pacific Tourism Organization. The CEO, he gave a video interview recently and talked about asking donors to sort of help the industry get back on their feet in the future. Yeah.
Okay. Very well. So as you all mentioned, we don't know what will happen in the future, and that's the second part of our chat. So I'll be asking you what is going to happen.
Well, hang on, Denis. Before you ask that, I mean, surely we can just ask the econometricians at Hong Kong Polytechnic, because they're doing all the forecasting, so surely they forecasted it. Or we could ask Ian Yeaman, the futurist. I mean, surely he also knows what happened, right?
I think I have my chapter in there.
What did you predict, Wantanee?
Predict about this? Well, I predict that soon there will be some vaccine, and I hope and then but I think it would take some time to kind of boost the confidence. I think like I can just talk about myself. I think I will be a bit scared of traveling at the moment, and also well, it depends, like where you go, and I don't think it's going to pick up very soon. Like kind of the travel, the traffic, like we're not going to see it as like kind of like 2018 or 19, right? And that is now we have like April, so and people still dying, right? And then we have like now the statistic for the positive cases is about like nearly 1.6 million already, right? It's increased, like still increasing, even though it's locked down. And yeah, so, you know, I don't know like how long people would just like kind of feel comfortable to travel again. You know, for me, it's like this for destinations at the moment, you know, it's very difficult to, I think promotion is a bit like, you know, like, I don't know, what you guys think? It's the right time to promote, like, you know?
Well, it's probably just too early to do any promotion. I think good responses from some GMOs like Portugal was to actually prepare a video saying you should stop and not travel. So if you look on Visit Portugal website and their video, it's time to stop, it's called. So I think that's kind of initiatives and probably other things DMOs can do. Is just to try to keep engaged with their partners. So our DMO here, Tourism Tropical North Queensland, and does online training with different travel agencies. So they just try to maintain a relationship and engagement. It's an interesting question. To what extent people will be scared of traveling in the future and reduce the travel. Just last week we saw during the Qingming Festival and opening of China, there was a huge overcrowding of some of the scenic areas like Huangshan in Anhui, because apparently they were not that afraid to get back together and look at the scenery. What do you guys think?
I think, Denis, to me, I think for many, for example, here in Victoria, in Australia, I think there's a great deal of optimism that while international tourism will drop off, domestic tourism might be the bright spot. You know, instead of people who live in Melbourne going to Bali for 2 weeks, perhaps they might, you know, jump in a car and drive 2 hours north or east or west and have a local holiday instead, right? So it seems to me that here, the regional tourism organizations are shifting more towards promoting to the local areas rather than, say, interstate or elsewhere. I mean, I guess the extent to which tourism will be kickstarted again will depend on, you know, the travel supply chain getting into gear again, right? This week we hear in Australia that Virgin have suspended domestic flights. So it's kind of difficult for people to travel within a country without those flights. But in a large country like Australia, and to some degree Japan, where public transport is good, I think there's a great deal of, if there is a silver lining, it's that people, rather than traveling overseas, will holiday at home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so
I
that's,
think that, I was going to say that, that's a good point, Joseph. And of course, for the Pacific, that's not so good, of course, with Australia and New Zealand being the main markets. So,
right.
It's going to be, I think, a little bit of a hard time. They may well, heavily discount again. You know, I think people, subjectively make a decision about how risky versus price. And we can say price is an infinite, is priceless, but that's not actually true. You know, if when Malaysian Airlines drop the price enough, then people weigh up the risks and think, well, sure, if I drop out of the air or go missing again, I'll take a Malaysian airline flight. And I think, to some extent, it's going to be, it depends on the person's risk aversion and, what the destinations do, I guess, and the airlines do to reassure people. It may well be that, there'll be, we talk about what's a post-COVID world going to look like. I think there'll be compulsory temperature testing, and depending on how quickly, these, and they talk about these rapid testing. I don't know how rapid is rapid testing, but this may well be a thing that before they allow you to get on the plane, and the airlines couldn't, or destinations could insist on this. Similarly, like after the terrorist attacks, now we can't take gels or a certain amount of liquids. So I guess that's a couple of things there in terms of future safety or checks that are going to happen in the future.
Yeah, I think in Thailand we had like requirement that you have to have like a COVID test before you fly, like within 48 hours or something. Yeah, but again, you know, like in Thailand, I think it's a different story.
Yeah, I also think it's an interesting point whether the limit to international travel or travel in general will be psychological or economic. On the other hand, it's also related to the number of people that are unemployed, and so tourism is a luxury. It uses disposable income. So if people have less disposable income, they just cannot travel. So that probably will take a longer time just because of economy starting up again.
Yeah, I think we also should talk about like what happened to us, right? Like I find it interesting also about, you know, like we're talking, you know, like, you know, tourism concept, like, you know, like tourism about escape, right? And like to get out, you know, when you feel like kind of depressed, like, you know, working hard, you need to get out somewhere and to relax, right? Escapism. And you know, I talked to so many friends of mine, you know, in Hong Kong. I think one of the most like frustrating is that they cannot get out. You know, I think it's because it's also part of tourism, right? You go out and, you know, but now they, you know, like Hong Kong is a good gateway. You can travel to Bali, like 4 hours, Thailand, you know, 2 hours, you on the beach, you know, like to Vietnam, Da Nang, 1 hour and a half. And so apparently, you know, I talked to a couple of people and they really miss that kind of like, kind of a short break and to get out because, you know, like, you know, they already get like very, you know, like being at home, right? Quarantine and stay at home, work from home. And so, and not able to get out to escape from, you know, like the more like very demotivating situation at the moment. And I find that like, you know, that is also kind of a mental, not mental issue, not yet, right? And so, and I think that it's also interesting to see like, you know, what happened if you cannot get out, you know, that's a kind of a traveling or escape from, you know, work stress and, you know, from, you know, all this worry.
Although I got to say, with the amount of tourism academic conferences that have been postponed, that 2021 is going to be chock-a-block full of, you know, conferences.
Yeah.
Academics traveling around the world for different things. So.
Yeah.
We'll postpone all our classes and just go to conferences.
Well, that's what it looks like.
But Steve, you raised a very good point. You know, you see now everyone's kind of destinations are running around thinking, how do we, you know, how do we get the wheels moving once recovery is possible? You know, and I saw one idea raised the other day about how travelers will be given certification when they travel. So if you can show a certificate to say that you are virus free, then you can get on a plane or enter a destination. You know, other destinations are offering vouchers to people, you know, and we see that the tendency, especially for airlines, is rather than refund you your airfares, they're saying, no, we will hang on to it until you can travel, you know, and some hotels are doing that as well. And, you know, I know in trying to come from Japan to Australia, I booked another flight with a different airline. They canceled the flight, but they didn't refund my money and said, you know, we'll give you a voucher for next time. And I think there's a lot of people who might have these kinds of sums of money paid for a holiday already and are eager to get going, right? I think the biggest obstacle will obviously be whether people can move around with ease, whether mobility is restored. Because unless the airlines are going again, then international tourism is pretty much at a standstill, which comes back to the idea of domestic tourism in Japan, because the public transport system, especially trains, are so good. It's easy for people to move around, you know, from Tokyo to the south or further north. So I saw Tahiti the other day. They put something. They put a press release out saying, we will save the beautiful islands and beaches for when you're ready to travel again. So I think a lot of DMOs are trying to stay front of mind, but whether travelers will overcome the hesitance that you mentioned, Wantanee, whether they will, China in particular, will people be non-Chinese be prepared to travel to China again in the near future? So I guess there'll be a lot of work for marketers in the next few months, and journal articles that can come out with the top 10 ways to revive your tourism industry will be very popular.
Yeah, that's a good point. And another discussion seems to be around the sustainable tourism and whether the tourism can change towards being more responsible and sustainable. And we briefly mentioned cruise tourism. So it's probably one of the least sustainable ways of traveling. And now to the negative aspects of cruise tourism is added the pandemic. So do you think will cruise industry survive and maybe change in a way? And then the other additional part of the question is, do you think tourism will be more or less sustainable?
I know Joseph's obviously done some fair bit of work in the cruise. I think cruise tourism's close to dead, at least in the near. Yeah, I mean, no pun, but that I know I've tried to attract a younger audience, but and a clientele, but mostly it's still old, dominated by old people. They're not paying tax, are they, in where they port, but because they're flagged elsewhere, and I think people are outraged a little bit by these, Bahamas, Panama. And I just think it's as other people have said, it's a human sort of petri dish, isn't it? That unless there's some sanitizing technology that is developed in the medium term, then which may well reassure people, then I don't see it very at a very attractive niche in the near future. I mean, in terms of sustainability, my other point I wanted to raise is, again, the poor Pacific Islands are similar. We talk about, and lots of discussion, fairly Eurocentric about climate change and not air travel. The only way to get to a lot of tourists or a significant amount of tourists to the Pacific Islands is to fly. And yes, they're going to be the ones that are most affected by sea level rise and climate change. But, that's the trade-off is how else are you going to get people here to spend the money, which employs, tens of thousands of people. So, it's a similar sort of argument. It's all going to be more sustainable, but you still got to get, air travel's the key to more remote, if you want to say, the pleasure periphery, so to speak.
Just on those two issues, Denis, and to follow what Steve has said. I mean, we looked the other day. I looked at Carnival's share price dropped by about 88% in the last couple of weeks, or from its previous high. So the large cruise liners are going to have a questionable future, I think. But I read some comment in the press the other day saying that despite the current furor around cruise tourism, forward bookings are still quite solid. So it makes me think. Well, is the allure of cruising, because it's so cheap and convenient and you can go to multiple destinations, does it overcome the risks? Because for a long time, there's been this kind of joke that if you wanted to get rid of someone, the best way to do it is to go on a cruise when you're out in the middle of, when you're in international waters and just chuck them overboard, right? I don't recommend that, by the way. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one. But the large cruise liners, I think, are more vulnerable than the smaller expedition cruises. You know, the ones that might have, say, 150 people, where there's more space. You know, people are not eating at a buffet, that kind of thing. But I think this has been long overdue, because most people have realized that most people who are critical about cruise tourism recognize that, you know, for a long time there have been crimes on ships, and the environmental impacts of cruise tourism have been questionable. But I go back to your point, Steve, and it's a really important one. For us as critical researchers, we can moan about the environmental impacts and the social impacts, but ultimately, you know, the economic impacts and the impact on people's livelihoods, we can't underestimate, right? As for the sustainability question, Denis, if we asked to talk about that again, I mean, can we introduce behavioural change that will make the way we do things quite different? Maybe I'm a pessimist and I don't have much faith in human nature, but I think we're creatures of habit, and past crises have showed us that while there's been dips in tourism, if we talk about tourism and sustainability, while there's been dips in arrivals and visitation and things like that, eventually it's resilient enough to climb back in some destinations, as long as you can overcome those variables, right? And some of the variables are more extreme in places like Fiji, like you mentioned, Steve. If a destination requires people to jump on a plane, then there's a considerable barrier there. I see all of these discussions amongst our colleagues about sustainability and the community focus, and I agree with all of them. But ultimately, it's people's livelihoods that are at stake here, right? And for us as academics, it's easy for us to make these kinds of commentaries. But where are the solutions we provide? Like Steve has mentioned, if we say, okay, climate change means fewer flights, means Australians and New Zealanders shouldn't jump on planes to go to Fiji, what is the alternative? What solutions do we have to this predicament? That's all.
So, yeah, I think it's like kind of I think I agree with you about like kind of we can be like critical about environment, like kind of how would we contribute money to the local communities, etc., etc. But I think I could see that the safety like kind of would be very, very important. Like I never before in my life like washing my hands this often, and that is become like more like just very natural to me now. And that also I find like some airlines, the one that still flying, they really show more about like how they clean the aircraft. I think this is like more about like boosting the confidence, like kind of we keep cleaning, and like how would they what measure they take to make sure that they kind of protect or kind of have less issue with hygiene, etc. And I would see that more maybe in this year or next year, because people I believe still scared because of the number is been like crazy, like I said, like nearly 1.6 million, and
Yeah, I think I do pass to the sustainability, right? So one is the behavior of the consumer, and that apparently can be changed. Some of the research from Sarah Dolnikov, for example, shows that you just need to adjust your own operations to make the more sustainable behavior the default behavior. Like it's more convenient to be sustainable. But the other part is related to the industry rules and regulations and government action, something that Greta Thunberg is advocating for, right? And I'm worried that on that part there will be a step back, because on the one hand, I think government will be all the governments will be more interested in trying to rebuild the economy as soon as possible. And on the other hand, now the oil price is so cheap, it doesn't make sense to invest in renewables. And so I'm afraid that from the organizational perspectives, the issues of sustainability will not be a priority in the near future. So it will kind of step back.
Yeah, I think you're right, Denis. I think you know, the desire to travel, especially for people who live in developed countries, you know, is still very strong and in line with the consumer behavior to shift away from material things to experiences, right? The experience economy. So, and I see lots of predictions about, you know, whether it's 6 months or 9 months or 12 months. But I kind of feel like it will be, you know, it'll be like when a famine ends. You know, people have missed out on so much and foregone so many things. There'll be this kind of enthusiasm to rush back and reclaim experiences, visit your family, visit your friends, you know, have the birthday parties that you didn't have, the weddings that were delayed, and all of these kinds of things. So 2021 might show a real spike in economic activity. You know, people will be spending, if they have the money, assuming, you know, there'll be all of this pent up demand for travel and, but there's still a lot of water to go under the bridge, I think.
So should we expect overtourism volume 2 book from you, Joseph?
Well, I think like Spain is a very good case. I said Spain, you know, like, you know, now like the over-tourism like problem just gone.
Yeah, well, you know, the old phrase, you know, be careful what you wish for, you might get it, right?
Yeah.
In many communities now, I think the pendulum has swung to the extreme other end, and you know, for some people they say, oh well, you know, the benefit of having the sky clears and the water quality be better, and you know, is that a decent enough trade-off? And I guess ultimately it will be about trade-offs. Will popular destinations like Venice and Barcelona, will people no longer go there? I'm not sure. You know, I doubt it. I think the secret will be how quick we get a vaccine, right? As soon as a vaccine,
I think it's like it's
yeah.
I was thinking also like if they get it, you know, like maybe not in a few months they will travel, you know. And I also read some news about Thailand that, you know, like foreigners couldn't go back, and then the government, you know, they overstay, they got to get fined, and the Thai government at the end offer them like automatic the extent without, you know, queuing and things like that. And then, you know, it's a debate, you know, online, the social media. And, you know, the tourists in Thailand said, oh, we're not coming back again, you know, just like we're not treated well, you know, and the hotel closed, kick us out, you know, and then something like, oh, you will come back because you're still looking for cheap beer and cheap food, you know, cheap, you know, like amazing beach, you know, at the end they will come back, but we don't know, right? Kind of like when. Yeah, I think there will be the same. I predict like Barcelona, you know, like kind of the, you know, food tourism, the kind of the world class UNESCO sites will be there, and I think if they know that, you know, like kind of, all right, you know, we have vaccine now. If you have this COVID-19, you know, it's just like a normal flu. Maybe hopefully in 1 year, and then it can be cured. And I think they will. I would see that they will go back, you know, but again, it's hard to say when, right? This is my own thing.
Yeah, I think it depends how long it goes on for. I think if it's if things go back to normal, or even yeah, let's say a business's domestic economy starts back up in May, even June, then international flights later in the year, or a little bit after that. then yeah, I think people will just see it as some sort of blip, and we're back to business as usual. I think if it goes on for quite a long time, you know, let's say till the end of the year, then I think this will quite affect people's psyche and values, and I think we'll see a more fundamental shift on the way things will work out.
Yeah. Good point. Another question for the midterm, I think, is whether we will see enough people who will want to study tourism and hospitality in the future, and whether there will be problems of finding talent, human resources to supply the industry. Since we're all working at universities, what do you think about enrollments?
Yeah, I mean, here, Denis, in Australia, there has always been a great reliance, as you know, on international students, especially in cities like Melbourne and Sydney, right? And the impact is quite considerable on universities, I think. We talk about tourist confidence. I think we also need to talk about international student confidence, right? We see more Chinese studying at home than going abroad. I'm not so sure. I think as well as finding a vaccine, I think the other thing is whether the global economy can stave off a recession, right? Can all of this printing of extra money and, you know, monetary stimulus help overcome that? Or will it need to go for longer? You know, we speak of we hear of the trillions and trillions of dollars that the American government, the Australian government, in Hong Kong, in Fiji. I mean, will that be enough to stave off the stimulus? Will that stimulus be enough to stave off a recession? Because that can cut quite deep. And I mean, if we are trying to consider what scenarios might play out, as always, we look at past incidents as a guide to what will happen in the future. I mean, I remember when the Bali bombing happened, everyone said Australians will never go back to Bali now. It didn't take long before that recovered, you know, and we can think of many other disasters and pandemics. We seem to eventually overcome these things, but this one is, if this one is unprecedented, then we still have a long way to go, right?
People are very myopic. Yeah. And they don't remember history, do we? You know.
Exactly. Yeah. As long as it's cheap, it's convenient.
But will tourism jobs be attractive?
I think at first it'll be very competitive. So, you know, tourism will be small, let's say, or yeah, you know, has shrunk, and the rehiring will be very competitive. There'll be, you know, there's lots of people out there with experience that want to. So the, you know, the first guys to get back will when the hotels open, they'll have you know, they'll be able to, depending what they offer, maybe the better employees or the better students, graduates. Then I think the importance of understanding tourism, or importance of understanding tourism for the economy and for society, surely can only, well, I don't say surely, but I think will grow. But whether the actual industry itself, or industry, or, you know, sector, whatever you want to call it, it needs more graduates will depend on much. It will depend. Is a demand issue, you know, the supply will meet the demand, and so we come back to are people going to want to travel, or what are they going to do? Yeah.
Wantanee?
Well, you know, I just I think that it's like kind of I'm not quite sure about, you know, if the number will sort of decrease in terms of like kind of you know, student wanted to studying tourism and hospitality, but maybe I talk about maybe different aspect, if you don't mind. It's like kind of I find like sometimes I was discussing with some professor in Australia, and talking about like, what is actually like tourism? What are you like with undergrad? Like, what are you studying, right? is there any kind of solid knowledge at all? You know, you're studying like principle of tourism, you're studying here and there, coming like who are you? Like, what do you know, right? It's like, you know, you're studying architecture or something, right? And I think I saw that the kind of trends, I think it's like in Spain. Also, I talked to some professor in Spain and in Greece. Now they have like a tourism that combine, you know, working with different sort of departments, you know, like with law departments and with the like nursing departments, to more like getting the kind of perspective of other, you know, like kind of perspective, you know, like kind of tourism law, and also like kind of I could see this like definitely like the number decline, but if we add more, how would I put it, more like kind of more like solid knowledge to, you know, confront with the pandemic like this, you know, like kind of like what would happen like this, and you know, like the people, the students who work in a hotel have some knowledge about, like, you know, a basic understanding of particular you know, safety and things like that. I think that would, if you add that into, you know, curriculum, it's, you know, this is my guess, that maybe it's like the you know, the students would see more value to that, you know, because it's like, it seems like tourism now is as a, you know, kind of a major, is like, you know, student would think, you know, when you interview a student, like, oh, you know, why you want to apply for tourism and hotel, but hotel, I think they're more like kind of very solid knowledge about, you know, hotel, but tourism, it's like, oh, I like traveling, right? I want to be flight attendants, you know, all these kind of like, kind of, you know, answer, or maybe it don't make sense. You know, but
yeah, you do.
You know, have some sort of like a solid, like they can, it's something situation like Bali bombing, right? Kind of any particular things that they can do for hospitality and hotel industry, etc., etc., and add more into like sustainabilities and things like that, because you know that it's not many places like, you know, the tourism department that actually offering some sort of like a subject called sustainable tourism, right? You know, it's more like embedded in other subjects, you know. So I think, you know, like kind of if I can see that if they kind of revise curriculum that is kind of take the actual you know, issues into the, you know, into consideration, into the embed that into curriculum, that, you know, more well-rounded, you know, like kind of climate change, what would happen, what would it do, and not only fragmented, you know, like kind of embedded in, you know, different subjects that that would maybe give some kind of confidence and to the students who maybe would like to enroll in tourism, you know, major.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that we probably need to rethink some aspects of the curriculum, or even the structure where tourism fits in different degrees and maybe interdisciplinary degrees. But I also hope that there will be more pressure on the companies to improve their HR policies and benefits and safety nets for the employees, maybe reduce the number of casual people, you know, at least provide some kind of safety net. What if a crisis happens? Because it's really painful to watch how many casual people just left without any income.
Yeah. Can I say, Denis? I mean, this issue to how to professionalize tourism and hospitality as a career is a very, you know, we've been battling with that for a long time, right? You know, I know students of mine from over 10 years ago who started in tourism and then take that skill set to another industry that pays better, that has better working conditions. You know, I think it's going to be an ongoing struggle. How do we professionalize the industry, and how do we compensate people with the skills, you know, because like I just think about some of my students who take the skills that they have from the service industry to hospitality, and they might go and work in a bank, you know, or with a public service organization and end up where they've ended up being paid more. It's always been a struggle. You know, how do we give students a skill set that might not only allow them to get a job in hospitality and tourism, but maybe somewhere else as well, right? And I think we often underestimate that the skill set we give them, you know, it gives them probably a wider range of things to choose from, especially service industry jobs. But I read an interesting paper the other day. Some Spanish scholars, as a result of the virus, have talked about how many service industry jobs like hospitality and tourism shouldn't be seen as service industry, but should be seen as care industry, because we take care of people rather than only serve them, right? And when you kind of think about things from shifting from a service to a care industry, like perhaps nurses and the like, it probably gives it more value in that kind of, you know, just academic way. But whether that translates into practice is the other thing, right? Will people see waiters and bartenders and, you know, butlers as care workers rather than service industry workers? I'm not sure. I mean, in Fiji, as an example, Steve, or, you know, Fijian hospitality is well known. You know, people will go with their families where children are cared for, you know. But maybe that's just an academic discussion rather than a practical one.
All right, so any final comments?
Stay positive. I think, you know, that's what's the alternative is to not be positive, right? I think I feel confident that things will come back in time. It's just a matter of how quick.
Wantanee?
Oh yes, I try to stay positive. I try so hard, you know, like it's more like a job, like every day, like I'm okay, everything's gonna be fine, you know. And yeah, so yeah, yeah, I think I have to be strong for my students, definitely, you know, like I cannot be like, you know, feeling down or like how you guys doing today, you know, like they have to see me like all bright and, you know, like, okay, just we have to pass this together. And you know, and I know that you know about my case, Joseph, and maybe you don't know that I teach a subject called International Tourism Studies. We were supposed to travel to Spain.
Oh.
It was like last year decided, and then now we don't have, like, no way we can go, right? It is like kind of so the deadline is like, okay, middle of April, we're going to make decision, we're going or not, but definitely we're not going. And it's like how to structure my course now, because we weren't supposed to have lectures, you know, now we have lectures. And then like I organized the, what you call it, like kind of the experience Spain in Hong Kong, which is like, you know, we're going to go to restaurants, having tango, flamenco dance, like paella cooking. And but it is really, you know, like, I think, you know, I try to put more effort into action, you know, like doing something. And I think it's, for me, it's good time for maybe doing something new. It's easy to say when you feel so down, right? You know, I encourage my students also, like, guys, I know that you're busy, but, you know, like, but, you know, trying to do something new. And I just like register myself in online courses at Yale University. And I found that, like, all right, you know, maybe using this, you know, like, to make, you know, to give yourself some kind of routine, you know, work from home, what would you do? And yeah, just stay positive and doing something, you know, action. I think that is like the only thing I can say, you know, like not, you know, like Netflix all day, maybe it doesn't help. Or like watching like kind of exercise for like 3 hours in your couch, right? You know, you are, oh, that's good exercise, but just do it. Yeah.
And Steve, your microphone is switched off.
Muted.
I mean, selfishly, well, I didn't mind the old regime. You know, it's quite nice traveling around, but I guess you know, this has given some you know, pause for thought. But yeah, I mean, unless there's some massive paradigm shift, then the Pacific Island countries are going to suffer you know, quite a lot with for some time until yeah. So unless I guess access and transportation is quite obviously it's important the further you are away from the major markets. So but am I optimistic? Well, am I ever optimistic? I'm not sure I am. Yeah.
Of course, it's going to be like, very sunshine day, like, at the end of the tunnel, right?
Yeah, light at the end of the tunnel. Yeah. I mean, I was glad I haven't organised any conferences for 2020, but so I guess that's positive. Anyway, no, we'll wait and see. I mean, it's a bit difficult to say at the moment. I mean, it does make me reconsider and think about what we actually teach our students. And, I think, unfortunately, some of our material is a bit dated. So it probably gives us a chance to rethink what's important in terms of technology, in terms of, crisis management, in terms of strategic marketing. So I think that's a positive. As tourism academics, gives us a chance to, or should give us a motivation to keep our what we do teach relevant to the students and to the industry and to academia.
Can I just say, Denis, if there's one thing this crisis has taught us, is that travel is more important to us than we even think, right? And the need for socialization and social contact is so much more important than we ever thought. And perhaps we'll come out of this valuing those things differently.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I also hope that there will be some revaluation of some of these values. And I think we will still live in a globalized world. I can't imagine myself not traveling, being in Australia and having one side of family in Russia and another side of family in Mexico. There's no way to escape long-haul travel for me. And also a good point on the technology. It actually showed us what things we can do remotely, and maybe there will be some change to some of the business travel. Maybe they will not need to travel and we'll see more meaningful travel instead. And thank you for all the comments, and we'll stay positive and stay in touch online. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Denis. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Wantanee.
Bye.
Yep.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you.
Bye-bye.